So as I was thinking about this, I was really thinking about a couple of people over the course of my research who have really helped me to think about what I think the aims of education are. And one of the places where I see very clearly people thinking about the aims of education are in refugee camps where I work, where refugee teachers and students will constantly say that education is about hope for the future. And I think these two aspects of hope and future really come together in how I think about the aims of education, in being really aspirational, in providing that kind of hope and imagining for kids, young people, adults, kind of a lifelong learning approach. And then in this idea of thinking about the future, again, kind of forward-looking, aspirational, in providing opportunities and occasions on which children and young people can learn the kinds of skills and knowledge and ways of interacting with the world that will help prepare them for the future that they imagine. In a couple ways it influences the way that I think about my research. I think that I try to have this, again, kind of aspirational dimension to my research in thinking not only about kind of observing what is now, but also particularly I think because I do a lot of interviews with people, of asking them not only about the present but also about the future. And so asking people how they imagine learning could be, how they imagine a school could be, how they imagine education in their lives. Another aspect or kind of aim of education that I see as really critical is related to relationships. And I think that education provides different kinds of spaces, whether they're formal schools, whether they're informal learning settings, for individuals to learn about how to function as part of a group. And I think that in building those kind of relationships, whether that's between young people, between teachers and young people, between families and teachers, that many skills and, again, ways of being in the world are learned in hopefully somewhat safe spaces where kids can try things out and figure out if they work, if they don't work, if they kind of backfire on them, or and what they feel comfortable with. And I think that examining those kind of relationships and how they play out in a learning setting, again, whether that's formal or informal, provides a lot of insights into both the content and the kind of quality of how learning is going on. And so a lot of my research I actually shape around relationships. I think that doing participant observation within settings is about building rapport, about making sure that the classrooms or the communities in which I'm observing, that I feel comfortable there and that people feel comfortable with me there. And that's a long process of building relationships. And similarly with interviews, that it is this process of building rapport so that people feel comfortable sharing their stories and perspectives. I do think that a lot of these conversations, I mean, I think that any interview is a kind of intervention to a certain extent, because it's a process of building a relationship and engaging in conversation, even though I always hope to do much less talking than the person that I'm interviewing. That clearly the person I'm interviewing is influenced by what I'm saying and the kinds of questions that I'm asking. And I feel like I take my cues from the person who I'm interviewing about how they're thinking about education, how they're thinking about whatever particular topic that I'm looking at that particular moment. But I do ask a lot of forward-looking questions, and so I guess in some ways it could be a kind of intervention that way, or at least an attempt to ask research participants to think about things that maybe they haven't thought about before. And I think in some ways that's a kind of reciprocity that's built into research too, of in asking people to share their stories with me, I'm asking myself to think in different ways and learn in different ways. And then in asking particular questions or in bringing topics of research to communities, that by its very nature is also asking people to think in different ways or open themselves up to new ways of thinking. And I feel like there's a real cyclical nature to research, and so I attempt for my research questions to really derive from communities and what I observe to take place, or what I hear from people in terms of priorities, and then see the dissemination as circling back to communities in the end. So for example, if, and I use this in my interviewing class as well, where we work as a class with a community organization based out of the Phillips Brooks House here at Harvard, to figure out what the priority is in terms of a research topic, and then design the research around that research question, collect data, do analysis, check those analyses with the participants in the community, and then make a presentation of findings to the community, to the people involved, in this case with the after-school program, and have a discussion about those findings. So that's not these are the findings and this is the end, but really as a way to have a discussion about what we found and what some of the next steps going forward will be. And clearly that's not the only way I think about disseminating research, but I think that's a really important feedback loop that again is centered on some of these aims of education around relationship building.
How do you do that in refugee camps?
So in a number of different ways. I mean, the first longitudinal study I did in refugee camps, everyone said there's no way you can't follow refugees over time because they move. But I decided it was really worth trying, because the way that education has long been thought about in emergency settings is very kind of one moment in time, whereas I think of education as a very ongoing process, and we can't just think about this one moment, but we have to think about this kid next year and the year after and 10 years from now. And so understanding what children's experiences are over time really matters. And so that process of following, in this case, following 80 children over 3 years was very much a process in relationship building, so that when kids and families moved, they were sending me letters or leaving messages about where they moved, because they knew that I was coming back and knew that it somehow mattered to them, because we'd built a relationship that they wanted to continue. And then in the final, after the final stages of data collection, it meant going back to these particular camps. And in this case, I decided to do what I called advocacy workshops, in building on some of the findings from this research and some of the areas that communities identified they wanted to really be more proactive on in terms of involvement in education and improving the quality of education in the settings, of doing some work around the kind of advocacy and participation skills that they might use in order to affect some of that kind of change. And so that was a way of kind of disseminating the findings, but also providing a kind of intervention that was what the findings indicated. And so that's one way I think of doing that kind of work in refugee settings. And I think another is a kind of, I think maybe a common method of doing this, but we don't always think of the outcome as dissemination, of kind of years of research that add up to certain kinds of findings and lead towards the design of a curriculum or some kind of intervention, that intervention then becomes a dissemination of research and a sharing of that with community. And so a project that I'm involved with now in northern Kenya, in the Dadaab refugee camp, which is a blended online face-to-face bachelor's degree program, is really the result of many years of research by multiple partners in thinking about what kind of educational opportunities are needed in a refugee setting and what that might look like, both in terms of curriculum and pedagogy. And so in some ways that's the dissemination of the research back to the community, but in a form that actually provides some of the solutions that have come out of the community all along the way. I think, well, I've thought about these things in a couple of different ways over time, but one of the things that to me has been really important is trying to make sure that the research process is not kind of all in books in a library at one point, all in the community at another point, all writing at another point, but that there's a real mix of these different parts of research. Because I think that in continuing to have interactions with people in the community while you're reading the literature, continuing to have interactions while you're writing up your findings, ends up, for me at least, helping to maintain this sense of why I or other people should care about what the issues are, because I can continue to interact with the people who this really matters to on a daily basis. And also continues to help to remind me of how I want to do research and to disseminate research in a way that is actionable, because it maintains this constant connection to community. So while I was a doctoral student, I think it really helped me to have an ongoing project in Uganda, this longitudinal study following refugees, which in the end was not my dissertation, but it allowed me during coursework and kind of early after coursework to continue to be with kids, with teachers in classrooms, and applying what I was learning theoretically to this context that I came in passionate about, but I think could have easily become detached from if I'd not been able to continue that engagement. And so I think those opportunities for students are critical in terms of seeing these constant relationships between what we're learning in the classroom and what we're trying to apply in the real world, in terms of keeping those passions active and in keeping in mind the many different stakeholders in this kind of research, which is clearly not just all of us sitting on Appian Way and writing. And I think that I think that advocacy has a real role to play. I'm very suspect of much of the kind of advocacy that starts from the message and then tries to go back to the research. But I do think that when we have research that is rigorous and tells a compelling story and points in a particular direction, that it's the responsibility of a researcher to get that message out. And whether other people term that advocacy or not, I think getting that message out is a critical responsibility of researchers. I do think that especially like in relatively newer fields, like I work in education and conflict, there is this desire to have research that backs up the messages that people want to convey. So like, we should fund education in conflict settings. Isn't there research that's going to prove that? And right now we don't have a lot of definitive research. That doesn't mean that the advocacy message is not still out there, but then I think it's also the responsibility of researchers to provide some kind of caution to those advocacy messages too, and be very clear about where we have clear evidence and where that evidence is still in the process of being built one way or the other.